Right now, the longest government shutdown in American history is paralyzing national security, and it all comes down to a high-stakes standoff over the U.S. border.
Yeah, I mean, the gridlock has completely frozen Washington, but, the ripple effects are quietly dismantling the nation's emergency readiness from the inside out.
Welcome to today's deep dive. I mean, just imagine standing in a massive, totally unmoving security line at Houston's Hobby Airport.
Right, just waiting for hours.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And you're watching a highly trained immigration tactical agent struggle to operate a basic baggage scanner.
Which is wild.
It really is. But this
Yeah.
is not a hypothetical scenario. It is the very real consequence of the 2026 Department of Homeland Security shutdown, which began on February 14th and has just shattered all previous records.
Yeah, it really has.
And the crisis started after a fatal border incident in January. In response to that, Democrats demanded strict new rules for immigration agents.
Strict is putting it mildly, honestly.
Right. And Republicans rejected those demands completely. Now they're using a really complex budget loophole to try and force through $70 billion in border funding without a single Democratic vote.
And no one is budging.
Nobody. Meanwhile, the real-world impact is hitting you and your community hard. We're looking at statistics showing a 55% absence rate for TSA agents at major airports.
This is just a massive operational failure.
Yeah, it's driving wait times up to 4 hours. At the same time, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has frozen grants, taken critical training offline, and lost funding for its primary hurricane tracking tool just as storm season approaches.
Which is honestly terrifying if you live in a coastal area.
Absolutely. So today our mission is to unpack how this historic shutdown started. We'll look at the $70 billion legislative maneuver trying to end it, and exactly how the hollowing out of Homeland Security threatens your travel plans and your disaster readiness.
Yeah, so to really understand why the airports are so chaotic and why emergency readiness is just stalling out, we first have to look at the spark that ignited this whole historic funding freeze.
Right, because this didn't just happen out of nowhere. We have to go back to January 24, 2026.
Exactly. So on that day, Customs and Border Protection agents, CBP, they were involved in an incident that led to the killing of Alex Preddy.
And before that specific date, I mean, Congress was actually moving forward with standard funding packages. Right?
Yeah, they were making progress. But that incident on January 24, it just shifted the entire landscape overnight. Senate Democrats basically drew a hard line in the sand.
Right.
They publicly said they would refuse to support the DHS funding bill unless some very strict new guardrails were placed on immigration enforcement agencies.
Let's actually look at those specific demands, because they weren't just asking for, general oversight or a committee review.
No, they wanted fundamental changes to how agents operate out in the field.
Yeah, so first, they demanded requirements for judicial warrants before agents could even enter private property.
Which is a huge shift.
Huge. Second, they wanted agents to verify a person's citizenship status explicitly before initiating any detention. Third, a total ban on the use of paramilitary-style gear. And finally, mandatory body cameras for every single agent.
Right.
So how do those demands actually alter the day-to-day operations at the border?
Well, from the Democrats' perspective, they see these as basic accountability measures, right? But operationally, implementing them requires a massive overhaul, like the judicial warrant requirement.
Yeah, how does that work in practice?
It fundamentally changes the speed at which agents can pursue suspected undocumented crossings across private ranch lands. And you have to remember, private land makes up a huge portion of the southern border.
Wow, okay, so it slows the whole pursuit down.
Exactly. And the Republican response was very swift. They pushed back hard against those changes.
Because they see it as crippling to the agents.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Republican lawmakers argued that these specific rules just add a dangerous level of bureaucracy. I mean, their position is that forcing agents to navigate all these complex verification hurdles in a real-time, high-stakes environment, it actively threatens the safety of law enforcement.
Right, because they're making split-second decisions.
Right. They view the ban on the specialized gear and the warrant stuff as basically tying the hands of the agencies that are actually responsible for securing the border.
And they didn't just say no, right? They fired back with their own demands.
Oh, absolutely. They countered with a proposal requiring local city and state governments to actively cooperate with federal immigration authorities.
Oh, wow. So suddenly a basic funding bill turns into a massive proxy war over local sanctuary city policies versus federal enforcement.
Yep, which of course brings the entire legislative process to a complete grinding halt.
So just to visualize this, it feels like two drivers playing a game of chicken on a one-lane bridge, but the American public is just trapped in the back seat.
That is a perfect way to describe it. Neither side will swerve.
And the crazy part is, while they were arguing over these rules, the clock just ran out. It triggered a brief 4-day shutdown at the end of January. But looking at the sources, it says that initial shutdown wasn't even about the policy fight.
No, it wasn't. It was totally procedural.
Wait, how does red tape cause a shutdown?
Okay, so it comes down to the mechanical rules of the House of Representatives. They have this strict rule requiring any new piece of legislation to sit for 72 hours before they can actually vote on it.
Ah, so they actually have time to read the bill.
Right, in theory.
Yeah.
But when you have a looming deadline, that mandatory 72-hour wait meant the funding technically expired while the temporary extension was literally just sitting on their desks.
That is so frustrating. But they did pass it eventually, pushing the deadline to mid-February.
They did. But they used those extra 2 weeks to just dig their heels in even deeper. Zero progress was made.
None at all. So on February 14th, the second massive shutdown begins. And this one only targets the Department of Homeland Security.
Right. Because neither side will swerve in this political game of chicken. Republican leaders are now deploying a really rare budgetary maneuver to just bypass the roadblock entirely.
Let's talk about that, the $70 billion reconciliation play, because the Senate actually did pass a bipartisan bill to fund most of the DHS, right?
They did. They found a compromise by surgically removing the problem. They funded FEMA, the Coast Guard, TSA, but they specifically excluded ICE and CBP.
They just carved the border agencies right out of the bill.
Exactly, trying to stop the bleeding everywhere else.
But House Speaker Mike Johnson completely blocked it. He refused to leave the border agencies unfunded.
Right, he wouldn't even bring it to the floor for a vote.
So Republicans pivot. They decide to fund normal DHS operations through regular bills, but use this loophole called budget reconciliation to fund ICE and CBP.
Right, which is a massive tactical shift.
Explain this reconciliation strategy to us, because normally you need 60 votes in the Senate, which means you need Democrats.
Exactly. Normally the Senate has the filibuster. But budget reconciliation is this narrow loophole. It allows a spending bill to pass the Senate with a simple 51-vote majority.
Wow. So it entirely removes Democrats from the equation.
Completely. They don't need a single Democratic vote.
And the amount of money they are pushing through this loophole is staggering. The House drafted a $69 to $70 billion package.
There's a massive.
Yeah. Looking at the breakdown, it includes $46.5 billion for border barriers, another $4.1 billion to hire and train personnel, and $2.8 billion for surveillance tech. How does that $70 billion compare to their normal budget?
Okay, so normally the regular budgets for ICE and CBP combine to about $30 billion.
Wait, so this maneuver literally triples their budget?
Yes, in one single move.
Okay, I have to ask about this. Wait, wasn't budget reconciliation originally designed specifically to reduce the deficit? How does adding $70 billion in new, unoffset spending fit into a tool meant to save money?
You're exactly right. The original intent back in 1974 was absolutely about fiscal discipline. It was supposed to force Congress to make hard choices to balance the books.
Right.
But over the years, it has morphed into this battering ram. Whichever party holds the majority uses it to pass their most partisan financial priorities without having to compromise.
And critics are sounding the alarm on the fiscal impact here, because they aren't cutting $70 billion from anywhere else.
No offsets at all, which means you have to borrow all of it. Over 11 years, this adds $140 billion to the deficit.
Just from this one bill?
Yes, because when you factor in the interest costs, it creates about $60 billion just in pure interest. And the crazy thing is, it blows right past the $1.62 trillion spending cap that Congress painstakingly agreed to in 2023.
So they're just throwing the agreed-upon cap out the window.
Pretty much.
Okay, so while politicians are maneuvering tens of billions of dollars on paper in Washington, the lack of immediate funding is creating a massive crisis at the nation's airports.
Oh, the ground zero of all this is absolutely the airports.
Yeah, let's talk about the immediate travel impact. Global entry and TSA pre-check were briefly suspended.
Because the administrative staff processing those apps were just furloughed.
Right, and then mid-March hits, and TSA agents miss their first full paycheck.
Which is the breaking point. You have people working highly stressful security jobs, dealing with angry travelers, and their bank accounts just don't update on payday.
I can't even imagine, and the statistics show exactly what happens next. 366 TSA officers, quit entirely, just walked off the job.
Yeah, they have to pay rent.
Exactly. And the call-out rates for the people who stayed just spiked. It hit a massive 55% at Houston's William P. Hobby Airport.
A 55% absence rate. That forces checkpoints to close entirely.
Right, which funnels everyone into half the space. Wait times hit 4 hours.
4 hours just to get through security.
So the administration tries to use a Band-Aid. They deploy unpaid ICE agents to the airports to help. But what is the logic behind sending highly trained immigration enforcement agents to run airport security scanners? If they aren't trained for the equipment, aren't they just standing around while the lines get longer?
That is exactly what happened. The passengers and the airport authorities view them as totally ineffective.
Because they didn't know how to use the machines.
Right, they lacked the specific security screening training. You can't just put a tactical agent in front of a millimeter wave body scanner. It requires hundreds of hours of training.
So they were basically just visual deterrents.
Yeah, and the data shows the wait times did not improve at all with them there.
Wow. It got so bad that President Trump had to sign an executive order directing DHS to just scrape together other available funds to pay the TSA agents.
Just an emergency accounting trick to stop the bleeding?
And amidst all this airport chaos, there's this wild detail about Delta Airlines. Delta actually stripped members of Congress of their VIP security line privileges.
I love that detail.
They revoked their fast-track access, basically forcing lawmakers to stand in the 4-hour lines they created.
It's fascinating to see a private company enforce a direct consequence on federal lawmakers like that.
It really is. But, 4-hour lines at the airport, that captures all the headlines. Everybody sees that. But the shutdown is causing a far more dangerous, invisible crisis in America's emergency management network.
The silent threat.
Exactly. Let's talk about FEMA and the approaching storm. Because by late February, FEMA had to suspend all non-disaster responses.
Meaning if your town wasn't currently underwater, FEMA couldn't help you.
Right. Preventative projects just stopped. And it triggered this massive training blackout. The FEMA Independent Study website and the National Disaster and Emergency Management University just went completely offline.
Which is a huge deal. First responders all over the country rely on those systems for federally mandated incident management training.
So new firefighters or paramedics can't get certified to deploy to a disaster.
Exactly. And veteran commanders can't keep their advanced certifications up to date.
And there's a severe financial squeeze, too. Crucial grant programs that pay for local emergency staff and equipment are totally frozen.
Yeah, and the International Association of Emergency Managers issued a warning about this. It hits rural areas the hardest.
Because they don't have a big municipal tax base to fall back on.
Right. Small towns rely almost entirely on these federal grants. They warn that rural areas might literally lose their emergency operations centers.
Wow. But the scariest part of this FEMA crisis revolves around the hurricane threat.
Oh, absolutely.
The government contract for a software tool called HurricVac is expiring right before hurricane season begins. What exactly is HurricVac?
So HurricVac is this highly critical tool used by emergency managers to model storm surges and plan mass civilian evacuation routes.
So it tells them who needs to leave and when.
Yes. And if that contract lapses because FEMA has no funds, these emergency planners are suddenly flying blind.
This sounds like firing the fire department's mechanics right before dry season. The trucks might run today, but when a wildfire breaks out next month, everything falls apart.
That's exactly what it is. And the government knew this was a huge risk. So in April, DHS controversially ordered thousands of furloughed FEMA workers back to the office, specifically to prepare for floods and hurricanes.
A forced recall.
Right. And the administration used whatever limited funds they had for some back pay. But here is the kicker. These workers are strictly forbidden from logging any overtime hours.
Wait, how do you map out a hurricane response with no overtime? Emergencies don't happen on a 9-to-5 schedule.
They don't. But the agency is legally constrained by this law called the Anti-Deficiency Act.
Right.
It basically makes it a federal crime for a government employee to obligate the government to pay money that Congress hasn't authorized yet.
So they can't even promise to pay them later.
Exactly. Their hands are totally tied, the workers are there, but they can't legally put in the extra hours desperately needed during a crisis.
It's just a cascading operational failure. To quickly summarize all of this for you, a tragic border incident led to this intense political standoff over immigration enforcement rules. And that gridlock triggered a massive legislative loophole involving $70 billion, while simultaneously breaking records for the longest shutdown ever.
Leaving airports crippled and disaster readiness dangerously exposed.
Exactly. And it leaves us with a really provocative thought to ponder. As the use of budget reconciliation to bypass political gridlock becomes more normal, how will this change the future of American governance?
That's the real question.
Yeah. If the only way to fund major federal agencies is through partisan loopholes, are permanent rolling government shutdowns just the new normal we all have to accept? And when the government fails to self-regulate, are we going to see more private companies like Delta Airlines stepping in to enforce operational realities on Washington?
It's definitely something to think about.
It really is. Something to mull over the next time you're standing in one of those endless airport security lines.